Next up, we have, at least from my perspective, one of the more anticipated players to really get on film and do a deep dive of in this entire draft process, and Kyle Pitts, the tight end out of Florida. As you guys know, if you've been a subscriber of the channel for a while, right, you'll know that I'm not a huge fan of college football, right? Outside of playing it, I'm not sitting there on my couch on a random Saturday afternoon in November cheering on Michigan to beat Ohio State, or I'm not into that whole thing. I don't have a horse in the race. I'm here, and when I'm watching college football, I'm doing it for the sole intention of finding guys and evaluating guys in terms of how I think they're going to translate at the next level, right? So Pitts is a guy that over the past year and a half, 2 years, I've heard a ton about, but haven't really dug my teeth into and seen what all this hype is about until now, obviously. On top of that, then being from Michigan, being a Lions fan, we're talking about a team who over the past decade and a half has spent 3 first-round picks on a tight end, right? So I might have a little bit of a different perspective of Pitts and the tight end position in general than most, right? Because I've seen firsthand, here's Brandon Pettigrew in 2009, here's Eric Ebron in 2014, as well as TJ Hawkinson, obviously, in 2019, right? So we're talking about a position that very rarely goes in round one. And, even when they do, sometimes it's a guy who maybe shouldn't have went in round one, as we've seen with a couple of those past Lions. So Pitts was most certainly an interesting guy to get into. And as we look at the stats, what you're going to see, obviously, right off the bat is pretty rapid progression, right? It's something that Mike and I have talked about in a lot of our videos now, that we're looking for a guy who continually gets better over the course of his college career. And, with Pitts, you see freshman year, didn't do a ton, right? Obviously only 3 receptions, but then, hey, you come back for that sophomore season. And when you take on more of that full-time role, you kind of explode, right? Obviously 649 yards, 5 touchdowns. That's great. Over 13 games, then you come back the next year and in only 8 games, you surpass those numbers dramatically, right? So we're talking about rapid progression here out of a guy like Pitts, which, when you consider his sort of athletic profile as well as some of the pro day testing numbers, really shouldn't be all that surprising that he's progressed like this, right? We're talking about a guy who is 6'5", 245, so obviously not some crazy built guy, but certainly has the height, has a large catch radius in terms of his arm length and those sort of things. And then you consider the testing numbers. We're talking about 22 reps on bench, 33.5-inch vertical, a 10-foot 9-inch broad jump, a 4.44 40-yard dash, which that's just phenomenal, as well as a 4.35 shuttle and a 7.12 3-cone. So athletically a freak, right? You can see why finding him up against safeties and linebackers might have been so effective, right? Because there's very few guys in the country who can match that sort of just physical profile. Obviously, when you put on the tape, then you see, Florida, they almost used him more so as a receiver than anything else, right? Very often he was lined up out wide. So it's not even like we're just talking about a strict tight end, like some of those other first round guys that I might have mentioned. We're talking about somebody who can kind of do it all, right? In terms of, he can line up outside the numbers, inside the numbers, off the ball as a slot receiver, detached from the line of scrimmage, on the line of scrimmage from a 3-point stance, right? We're talking about a guy who was used in a variety of ways. And I really do think that's probably how you're going to get the best use out of him as we get into how he projects at the next level, right? So first and foremost, you're going to see my tight end grading criteria, how I'm evaluating these guys. Primary, obviously, is your receiving ability. And first and foremost, you have to get open. So that's really what that first category should be called. It's not necessarily, just your route running, like, how crisp are these routes? Really anything to get separation, right? So there is a sort of speed and acceleration and quickness element into that grade. I shouldn't necessarily have just said route running, because that might give a connotation that that's what I'm simply grading. That's more your ability as a route runner to just get open, whether that means you're a 4.2 40 guy who's just creating separation that way, or somebody who's running crisp routes, or somebody like Pitts who's a solid combination of both, right? Otherwise, run blocking, I think, is still a pretty significant portion. Not quite as highly weighed as the ability to be a receiver and function in space that way, but I still think the most valuable tight ends that you're going to see are the guys like Kittle, who can do a little bit of both, right? From there, obviously, it's not only going to be your ability to get open, it's going to be your ability to convert those catches as well as make something of them after the fact. And, for people who maybe aren't able to get open in terms of they may have lower route running grades, it's also about your ability to convert those contested catches, right? Some tight ends lack the physical sort of athletic traits, I guess, but they're able to win matchups based simply off of more so their catch radius, right? And you're going to see them just climb the ladder and go up and and almost Moss guys in a sense, that would be more so the contested catch grade. I weigh that a little bit lower because I don't think that's really a sustainable way to win matchups unless you're an absolute freak like, say, a Jimmy Graham, right? So with Pitts then, right, obviously a guy who's highly regarded, you can see I'm sort of in that same boat. Route running and just his ability to get open, one of the best tight ends that I've seen personally, 18 and a half. The only thing that I would say is there are occasions when he is lined up on the outside where you would like to see a little bit more sophistication in terms of just selling cornerbacks on routes that he's not actually running, right? You want to see if he's running an outward breaking route, right? Take a step to the inside when you're at the top of your stem to make that cornerback believe you're running an in or some sort of post, right? Try to make them get out of position to give yourself an easier window at the back end where you've created more separation than to bring down that catch. I think that Pitts, obviously, even though he can bring down those 50-50 balls and does so at a very high rate, I still think that there is some slight room to grow there, even though compared to most tight ends, his ability to separate and just run routes is some of the best stuff we've ever seen, right? In terms of as a run blocker, being somebody who lines up so often as almost a receiver, I expected him to be pretty bad as a run blocker here. And I feel like a lot of people assume that he is. I didn't really see that, right? I saw a guy who, even at his sort of lankier frame, right, he doesn't have a ton of weight and mass behind him. He's still willing to stick his nose in there and try and dig you out, right? And he's going to try and move you off the line of scrimmage. And if he can't do that, he's at least going to try and position block you. So, the people out there saying, oh, he's just a receiver. Well, he's a pretty dang physical receiver then in that regard, because I don't think any receivers that I've watched so far in this class or any really previously could block as well as a guy like Kyle Pitts, right? In terms of his hands as well as just general consistency, I felt like he's about as good as you can get, right? And, ironically, being somebody who, as I said, has watched the Ebrons, has watched the Pettigrews, other first-round guys, he's in a different class, right? He is at the highest end of that spectrum because very rarely are you seeing him drop open balls. In fact, you're almost always seeing him catch those contested balls, as you're going to see a couple categories down there with the 9.5 out of 10. I haven't got to Kyle Trask yet, and I'm not sure if I'm going to, but man, so many of those passes, it just seemed like Trask would toss him up and let Pitts climb the ladder, go up and haul him in over a corner, over a safety, over a linebacker, or he would just throw them in the general vicinity and let Kyle Pitts make these circus-like catches that, I want to say 50-50 balls, but, for most tight ends, they're 10-90, right? The defender's going to be able to at least swat that away and make a play on that ball. The vast majority of the plays, well, with Pitts, it seemed like the exact opposite, right? It never seemed like he was out of contention for any of these passes, really, no matter how circus-like they were. And that's why I gave him a 9.5 out of 10 there. In terms of his rack ability then, just his ability to pick up yards after the catch and sort of transition from receiver to runner, I don't know if it gets better than Pitts, right? You could maybe say, oh, a guy like Kittle is more physical. I would personally put that in the strength category. I just think in terms of the sheer agility and elusiveness and speed required to pull away from guys and make plays on the ground, I think Kyle Pitts is about as good as you can get, any sort of the gold standard in that regard from my point of view. From there, I would say strength is one of his weaknesses, right? Obviously not a super strong guy. What did I say? 22 reps on bench. So not a weak guy either. Don't get that twisted. But no, he's not necessarily going to be somebody who's digging out defensive ends, right? He's not going to be somebody plowing over secondary players on a frequent basis, but it's still certainly within the realm of possibility, right? He could add weight to his frame if he so wants. I'm just not sure if that's the best use for him, right? If we look at Pitts 10 years down the line and we say, yeah, he didn't really ever get much stronger and he's not a very good run blocker still, right? Like, no player is perfect. And if he is a little bit weaker in those areas, that is absolutely fine, right? I think that you could almost argue that adding and putting on weight and strength could be detrimental to his game, right? Because it could slow him down. It could cause more difficulty in terms of separating when he's so good at that already now. Why even detract from it if that's why you're drafting him? So I think that there's some varying opinions there. A 6.75, when you have those other traits of Pitts, that's still a very good grade, right? If he was looking at middling numbers elsewhere, then yeah, I'd say I really wish you were stronger. But for him, that's his biggest weakness. I'll take that. And then lastly, in terms of balance, right, there's kind of two ways that you could take this. There's the more so run-centric way, as well as the as receiver way, right, in terms of balance and body control, or just simply like balance and leverage, right? Those are kind of the two ways I've done it to this point. This is a little bit of a combination of both. I would say that he loses the 1.25 more so as a run blocker, right? I felt like there's a lot of times where he could have some better leverage, could do a little bit better job than he does. But again, I'm not going to double count him necessarily in that regard. I'm not going to penalize him for the same thing twice. Run blocking is simply not his primary skill set. Whereas body control, in terms of just making these beautiful diving catches, making these phenomenal sort of sideline toe tap receiver like plays, that's where I thought he did incredibly well. And that's more so what carries the 8.75 out of a guy like Pitts. Lastly, in terms of the final two categories, size, catch radius, as well as athleticism, I gave him a 5 out of 5 in both. Like I said, I never felt like there was a ball that Kyle Pitts was unequipped to catch. I know some people, you might say, to dock the size one just a tad because of lighter frame, right? But for me, again, it comes down to how you're going to use him. Yeah, if he was going to be an inline tight end, that grade would certainly be lower than it's going to be with him in the role that I think he should play and needs to play at the next level, more so detached from the line of scrimmage and more so out in space making plays as receiver, right? So in that regard, I'll give him a 5 out of 5 on size. If you want to dock that a little bit, go right ahead. So overall, though, 87.75. Add in the position premium, which I did give him the tight end premium, which is slightly lower than the wide receiver one. So 3% of his grade, right, he gets back into itself. That way, when you're sort of comparing positions, if there was a quarterback 87.75, you would rather have the QB than the tight end, right? Because obviously having an elite quarterback is more valuable positionally than the tight end is. So that's why the premium exists. And that's why I gave Pitts the 3%. For the tight end premium. I probably could have split the difference between tight end and wide receiver. It wouldn't make a difference, though, to this point, right? Still my number one player on the board. And as you'll see, though, having scouted 57 players prior to Pitts, the gap between him and number 2 and number 3 and 4 and so on is pretty sizable, considering, I mean, you look at just those first round grades and the vast majority are very tight there between 82.94 and 85.90. Well, 90.38, considering that he is getting less of a position premium than a lot of those guys at tackle, DT, edge, et cetera, right? He's almost at an inherent disadvantage than those guys, considering the position that he plays, yet his raw grade is still so much higher. So my number one guy on the board, and at this point, it's just going to be a question of how do some of these QBs and wide receivers, and as well as maybe corners at the top of the draft, how do they compare, right? Do I have them graded similarly in terms of the raw grade? And then just due to the fact that they play more valuable positions, does that put Pitts down a couple notches? Or does he remain my number one overall player once we get 80, 90 guys on here? It'll be very interesting to see, and something I'm incredibly curious to watch for over these next couple weeks until the draft. And that's coming from somebody who certainly never would have expected to have a tight end number one, right? I just think Kyle Pitts is that much further along than pretty much everybody so far, right? And, for what his position requires to be good, I just think he checks almost every box that he can, as long as you use him in the right way. I will say that, right? I don't want you to see, oh, he's the number one player on my board. That automatically means, just give him a gold jacket now, right? Not necessarily, because, you look at kind of how the Lions used Eric Ebron, by example. The position he played at North Carolina was highly similar to what Pitts played at Florida. The Lions take him and they want to use him as somebody with his hand in the dirt for 80% of snaps, right? Instead of having him out splitting the difference as a slot receiver, right? They're looking at him as somebody in the box on running plays, and it didn't work out, right? Obviously, there was some other stuff that went on there, but if you're a team who drafts Pitts in the top 5, top 10, you better have a role planned for him, right? That's sort of the contingency on this high of a grade. I know for my sort of theoretical team here that I'm grading for, the role is plain and simple, right? It's just get the guy and put him in as many mismatches as possible on a snap-to-snap basis, right? That's the simplest way I could put it. If you're a team who is going to draft him and just because, he's a good tight end, but then use him as if he's George Kittle, no, I don't know if he would be my number one selection. I would probably rather go for some of those other guys, because at that point, you're not maximizing his skill set and his potential. So an interesting guy in that regard. I will say it's going to be interesting to see where he goes. A lot of people say, maybe Atlanta, maybe Dallas, maybe Philadelphia to replace Zach Ertz, maybe even Detroit. I've seen a couple of people say that. That seems pretty radical to me. But regardless, I hope it's a team that maximizes his skill set and maybe uses him more so as a receiver than a tight end. even though I think he, ideally can do and add to your team in both those areas, if that makes sense. But with that being said, then that's really all I have for you guys today. So if you did enjoy this video, make sure you leave it a thumbs up. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on Kyle Pitts in the comment section down below. Do you have him also as your number one non-QB on the board, or do you think there's other guys, especially at the positions that I've done so far? Because it's not very helpful to say, oh, I think Jamar Chase is better. I haven't watched Jamar Chase yet, and given him a grade and seen how he compares. But out of these guys, right, out of the tackles, out of the guards, out of the DTs, the edge players, the linebackers, where do you have Pitts graded there? Do you think he is number one? And if so, by how large of a margin? I know a lot of people are really focused in on, out of those top 4 picks, or those top even 10 picks, taking a QB or moving around to try and maximize the value of potential teams looking to get QBs. Well, I think that you could potentially, if you get Kyle Pitts outside of the top 5, I think that we're talking about maximizing value there, right? I think if you're a team who gets Kyle Pitts at 10, you have to be ecstatic, because by the time, like I said, I'm done grading all these guys, there's a very good chance that he is just my flat number one overall player, right? Which, as crazy as it sounds, I mean, at that point, you need a tight end or just a flat playmaker in general, right? Somebody who's going to add a whole new dynamic to your offense. I really do think Kyle Pitts would be a way to go, or at least a route that's highly considered, right? Maybe you say, oh, if we're Cincinnati, we'd rather have a tackle than a tight end, right? That's entirely fair. If you have that position premium slightly different based on your team needs, understandable, right? If you, instead of giving tight end, say, a 3% boost, if you want to give them a 1% boost and give tackle a 7% boost instead of a 4.75% boost, then your board would shift in that way, right? That's the problem with not scouting and laying these guys out for a particular team. It's just more so a general theoretical sense in that regard. So an interesting guy nonetheless. Like I said, leave a comment, tell me what your thoughts are on him. What do you think is the best and worst case scenario for Pitts? I've seen some people say that at his worst, he's a top 5 tight end in the league. And as crazy as that might sound, could you see him being worse than, say, a Darren Waller, like out of the gate even? I could almost see him in that regard, stepping out of the gate, and as long as he's used correctly, becoming a Pro Bowler pretty easily within the first year or 2 years here, right? Like, that's how highly I am on him, as you can see, as he's pretty highly above the rest of those guys at the top there. So, of course, let me know. Tell me what your thoughts are, and if you enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, hit that subscribe button, so that way you're constantly in the loop with my current uploads. Have been doing right around 2 a day, 3 a day here and there. I'm most certainly going to try my best to get as many of these prospects out to you guys before the draft late next week. So, with that being said, obviously, I'm mic'd up. Now I'm micing out. Peace, guys.